Hey team, so I've got something a little silly planned for today. I'm excited about it. The last Young Earth Creationism debunk I like legitimately got mad and I don't like being mad. So I'm taking a break this week from doing a debunk video. And instead, I thought I would try to merge together my love of nerdy storytelling with my love of science and all things weather and talk about um, weather in Dungeons and Dragons campaigns. And since the new guide to like Ravenloft is coming out pretty soon, I thought we would start by tackling Barovia, what type of weather you could expect in Barovia, and how to kind of incorporate that some realism into your game. So that's the plan. Um, and okay, sorry, I've got a nice topographic map of Barovia. The link to it is in the description. So let me share my screen, team, and we can. So I've got it in like a PowerPoint, a keynote slide, because I want to draw on it. So here is our nice topographic map of Barovia. And yes, team, I am fully aware that the mists of Barovia are fundamentally magical and don't have to make weather sense to the meteorologist nerd in the room. But it would be nice if they made weather sense. Okay, so first and foremost, the thing to notice about Barovia here is that we are in a valley. So let me make my face a little smaller for a second. So you see, we have this high topography here, proper labeled mountain here. So we've got mountains all along the northern border. Pretty darn big mountain here on the southern border, more high topography all around this. And if you kind of read about some of the lore of Barovia, it is like this valley, I guess country or region is the best way to describe it, because it's bigger than a city, you know, it's maybe it's a kingdom, a valley kingdom. Let's go with that. Ruled over by Strahd. And yes, Barovia has been transported from the mortal plane into Shadowfell, so into a magic evil land. Great horror campaign setting, right? That sounds awesome. However, Barovia was presumably a place in the real world before it was shuffled off to Shadowfell. And so in the real world, it would have had like weather and climate. And I'm just kind of assuming that it brought those weather systems with it, so that the weather of Barovia acts like the weather of Barovia in the Shadowfell acts like what the weather of Barovia would have been in the like mortal plane pre its transport into the Shadowfell. So that's kind of the things we're assuming. And for those of you that don't know, Barovia is surrounded by magical mists that keep the evil vampire Strahd contained in Barovia. So sort of once you're in Barovia, you can't leave because of the magical mist without, I think it's Strahd's permission, but that might be a Curse of Strahd rule. Anyway, so things. Okay, so let me tell you guys where I think we could draw an analogy between Barovia and like planet Earth. I think Barovia is going to specifically act like a valley in a very high altitude, like in a mountain range. And if we were trying, the easy answer to a real world analog probably feels like Seattle, but Barovia actually is not going to be very much like Seattle. And let me tell you why. So Seattle is super rainy all the time because it is on the windward side of a mountain range. So mountain, Seattle, ocean, right? And winds come across the ocean, across Seattle, hit the mountain, and are forced by the topography of that mountain. We're going to force that air parcel up. Okay. When we force that air parcel up, because it's trying to move across the mountain, but there's a mountain in the way. So the only way to go is up. That's going to mechanically move that air parcel up past its saturation point. So past the point where the water vapor in the air is going to condense into liquid water and form cloud droplets. If we keep forcing water into that cloud, then we will form like a rainstorm, right? And so it'll rain all on Seattle right here, right? Um, and the air, when that air finally makes it up and over the mountain, it's pretty dry, right? So on the leeward side of the mountain, the opposite side from Seattle, that air is actually remarkably dry and gets very little rain. And so very little moisture. So if we're thinking about a mist-filled valley, right, where we have high topography all the way around, we're not going to get those dynamics that you get in Seattle. So that's why I say it's going to be a lot more like a mountain, like high altitude mountain valley. So what does that get us? One, excuse me, my nose is itchy. One, those regions, especially in the winter, it's just super foggy every morning. And that's because the air that's in that valley kind of has nowhere to go. So if it was in a plane, that air would normally like rise, form a cloud, and move off, right? Like here in Oklahoma, it's very flat. There's little topography. So an air parcel that rises up off the ground just gets hit by the upper air winds and moves really far away. But the mountains here not only serve as like a windbreak, so we're not going to have a lot of wind moving through this valley. The air is going to be relatively still. Obviously, there's some wind, but it's not like here in Oklahoma, where today it feels like my house is trying to take off and launch into the air because of the amount of wind we're getting. It's just that's just a Tuesday here. So you're not going to get really high winds. So Barovia, like it's relatively protected. So not a lot of weather can get in, but also not a lot can get out. So think of it as like the moisture that's in the valley is trapped there. It can't go anywhere. So it just sort of forms as fog. And it is very much in the lore of Barovia that it's just constantly misty, constantly foggy. So let's start by talking about just basics of what we could expect. Okay, so one, it's going to be cold, right? Even in the middle of the summer, it's going to be cold here because we're thinking high altitude. If you really wanted to lean into that as a DM, you could lean into higher altitude. It's harder to breathe. Not as much oxygen. So until your players like the PCs like adapt to the region, or if they're not from there, they might be slower. You could run into that. It usually, by the way, takes about 2 weeks to acclimate to a higher altitude. But they could just be weaker and they could be slower. That might be a great way if you're bringing in PCs who didn't grow up in Barovia and dumping them into this setting. Make them deal with the altitude and the cold, right? And that, for a horror campaign setting, I think, and from what I know about Curse of Strahd, I've never actually played Curse of Strahd, but from what I know about that campaign, a theme is the feeling of hopelessness, right? And a pretty good way to like embody that and even make that a mechanic would be to like you get here and you're slower, or maybe you have an effect on your constitution, right? Maybe you lose a point or two of constitution, or maybe you hit levels of exhaustion faster, right? Like what would be normal activity anywhere else in Barovia gets you a level of exhaustion. I definitely know a couple of years ago, I got to go to Ecuador and hang out in the capital, which I can't think of the name of the capital of Ecuador right now. I'm so sorry. But I just walking around all day, I was struggling to breathe, or walking uphill. I felt tired and I was like, oh my gosh, like what is wrong with me? I am like young and healthy. Why is walking hard? And it's because of the lack of oxygen. So that might be a fun thing to play with. Second, that fog is always going to be heaviest in the morning. So picture this with me, right? PCs are camping, right? They're camping out in Barovia, and you wake up and you're in fog so thick that you can't see your like fellow adventurer, your friend sleeping 5 feet away, right? You can't see them. So you're going to feel isolated and alone, and you're going to be damp, right? Because you're going to have that dew collecting on you overnight, collecting on your gear. So you might be worried about your armor or your sword rusting, right? If it's winter, it can even freeze. So you get that frost, right? So think about that scene in Gladiator when the guy goes to draw his sword and he can't because the frost is stuck. That would be a very fun thing, I think, to play. Fun for the DM, right? For the players, I think it could definitely lead to this feeling of hopelessness. Another thing to remember is the air you're breathing. One, it's not going to have a lot of oxygen. It's not going to have as much as you're used to. And two, it's also going to be like thick and damp, right? It's going to just feel unhealthy, like this is breathing this air is how you get pneumonia kind of deal. Um, so you can do that. Uh, and I think you can really use the fog, especially in the mornings when it's going to be heavy, to amp up that sense of isolation and hopelessness and sort of add to the terror. And I would not, don't be afraid to keep the fog around. In general, fog will burn off during the day. So as the surface warms up, the air is able to hold more water vapor. So that liquid water, those cloud droplets that make fog, are going to kind of evaporate and go back to their gaseous state. But Barovia is also magical. So it's canon that there's constant mist. But maybe especially in the mornings, I wouldn't be afraid to throw in a like perception check disadvantage, either disadvantage or just a penalty to the check, something like that. Um, because of the fog. So like let that fog be a problem. I would really try to let it be a problem for your PCs. Let's see, maybe casting daylight would burn some of it off. You'd need like, but not instantly is the thing. Because you need it to warm up, and you need a large area of the earth to warm up. And so like a flash of daylight isn't going to do that. Here, I've got some tea. It's a like chamomile ginger tea, and I added some like fresh squeezed lemon and some honey, and it's so happy. Exactly what you would want to drink to comfort yourself from the mists of Barovia. Okay, so let's also talk about some stuff that you're not going to see here in Barovia. I don't think you're going to see a thunderstorm, not a proper thunderstorm. Why do I think that? To make a thunderstorm, you need a two air masses that are very different from each other. So normally we would say like ideally, the ideal situation is you want a cold, dry air mass to smash into a warm, moist air mass. And when they do that, the warm, moist air mass is much less dense, so it sort of rises quickly. So to make a thunderstorm, you need moisture, you need a lifting mechanism, right? So generally that's the difference in densities between two air masses. And you need a temperature difference. You really need all of those things to get like a proper thunderstorm. So I don't think you're going to get like thunder and lightning, out of Frankenstein summoning the elements to like raise your monster. I really don't think you're going to get that. But what you would potentially get are going to be just a dreary drizzle, right? And I actually think for tone, that's almost better. For me, I love thunderstorms, right? I find them exciting. I get sad if I go too long without hearing thunder, but that's an Oklahoma thing, I think. Because I know thunderstorms scare some people, but for me, they're just sort of exhilarating. Um, but thunderstorms are short-term events, right? Whereas I think playing with consistency of weather in Barovia might kind of add to a feeling of just everything here is unchanging. You can't affect it. It's gonna, the world doesn't care about you. And just a gray sky with a drizzle, right? A cold drizzle while you're like hiking somewhere just sounds like the most demotivating thing on planet Earth to me. Um, so that's definitely a thing you can play with. Again, the weather absolutely has an ability to make you feel miserable. I think sometimes we forget that because we live in our nice climate controlled homes. But if you're out in the elements, the weather matters a whole lot. And so, yeah, just like a dreary, light, cold drizzle that feels unending. Um, yeah, so maybe your wizard has to always be worried about whether their spell book is getting wet. Maybe yeah, anybody with a metal sword, right? They might need to be worrying about rust. Maybe you get tired quicker. I know I kind of already talked about that with altitude. But I'm just trying to think of ways to bring like mechanically bring in the feeling of the effects of the weather apart from just kind of the scene dressing. And I think, you know, a good trick if you're DMing and you want to bring in the effect of the weather, don't just say like it's raining. Talk about like talk about how as you're walking through the rain and you feel the drizzle that is that it's almost sleet, you know, it's rain on the verge of becoming ice and it hits your face and it hurts every time it hits. And as you look, you know, if you look up, you know, there's no warmth of sun on your cheek. There's no hint of this letting up. And just as the damp is just soaking into your clothes through your gear and into your soul. That would be how I would describe it if I was trying to be a mean GM or a mean DM. Sorry, I normally actually run games in Pathfinder, so I'm used to saying GM instead of DM, but you know, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. Okay. A few more things about Barovia that I think we can discern from this picture. Okay. One, let's put a shape in here. Let's put a little happy square. Okay. This guy, this lake, I don't want you to have a color fill. I want you to have a thick border. And yeah, I like hot pink. So this lake is our biggest source of water. So biggest source of water, so our biggest source of moisture for the atmosphere. So the fog is going to be heaviest around this lake. Locally, absolutely, it's going to be heavy. We've got a couple little lakes around here. So we'll have some heavy fog, heavy moisture there. And then further south here. Here we go. If we also assume that winds generally blow from west to east, so let's dump an arrow in. Oh, nope, don't do that. There's my arrow. Okay. if our winds are going to generally blow this direction, and let's just make that orange because I think that's better than black. Then, and by the way, I'm just assuming that blowing from west to east, I'm kind of basing that off of like Earth's global wind patterns. If you wanted to choose, like, nope, it's going to go east to west, go nuts. But let's just kind of pick a direction. Two, the lowest topography in this mountain valley is on this like western and eastern boundaries where we're sort of like here, there's the lowest topography, and kind of in here, there's also our lowest topography. So let me put that arrow where we've got that lowest topography. So you'd probably have the strongest surface winds actually around where I've dropped that arrow, because think of the air kind of getting funneled into the valley between the mountains. So it kind of depends on what the topography is going on off map here. You don't necessarily have to like do much with those strongest winds, but just know that that's probably where it is. So if we have these winds blowing across the lake like this, one, if it's winter, lake effect snow is a very fun thing to play with. So if the temperature drops really suddenly and we move air from like over here and we move it across this lake, it takes water longer to change temperature than the air does or than land does. So this is a relatively warm surface compared to the land around it, like at the start of winter. Or if you have a pretty sudden drop in temperature, like you're going to get a snowstorm. And so when we move air across this relatively warm and moist surface of the lake, it's going to pick up a lot of moisture. And then when it moves off the lake and ends up over here, so let's put a box over here where that air is going to like end up. Let's do that, and let's make it blue. Oh, you can barely see that. Okay, I'll make it like yellow. There we go. So in my yellow box is where you can see the heaviest snowfall. So lake effect snow is kind of one side of a lake. The leeward side of the lake gets snow just dumped on it. It can be like a foot compared to an inch on the other side. So that could be a fun thing to play with, especially really only if you're in the winter, but you could definitely get some big lake effect snow over here. I'm not going to mark like the leeward side of this or that lake because those are relatively small, and this one butts up against like a mountain, so it's not going to be quite the same effect. But this region over here, you could definitely dump a lot of snow. You could also play that as like where you get the heaviest fog if you wanted. Just for if we've got moisture here and we have air moving it off, what's that moisture going to do once we kind of get here, right? Get into this region. You could definitely get some heavier fog here compared to the rest of the valley. You could play with that if you so desired. And other than that, what I'd really say is if you're looking at the weather here, key things are going to be consistency. So having a high altitude automatically kind of makes that your change of seasons is less noticeable than it would be on the ground. So definitely have severe winters, but your summers, you're still going to need a sweater, especially in the mornings. I know when I was in Ecuador, that's driving me nuts. What is the capital of Ecuador? I'm Googling it on my phone. Capital of Ecuador. Quito. Gosh, Quito, super fun city. I loved it. Yeah, so I was in Quito in August, and I needed a sweater, right? I was cold. Yeah, uh, uh, because of the high elevation. So consistency, and I think you can really, like I said earlier, lean into the consistency as leaning into dreariness and hopelessness, and nothing that you do is going to change anything, right? She said, while grinning ear to ear, because I apparently enjoy making players suffer. Um, uh, Play with the fog. Know that fog is going to be heaviest in the morning and then kind of die off. Seriously consider setting your campaign in the winter, because then you get to have snow. Then you get to play with lake effect snow. Then you get to deal with frost in the mornings. You can have freezing fog, right? All kinds of nonsense. And as fun as it is to play with, like, as aesthetic as thunderstorms are, I'd actually veer away from like thunder and lightning and towards more of just like a cold drizzle. Um, yeah, I actually think that's kind of, another random thing, forests are going to be generally cooler than like this village region. Um, so our villages are going to be a little bit warmer. It's not going to be as noticeable in like a medieval setting as it would be like today. It's like measurable differences between urban areas and forests, but forests do very much locally provide a kind of cooling, stabilizing effect. um yeah, okay, I think that's all I've got for y'all on the weather of Barovia. Sorry, I forgot one thing. So I want to point out that we sort of have some winds coming up here and hitting a mountain. So our heaviest rainfall is going to be down here near this like southwestern lake. Sorry guys, I actually flip east and west, and I flip left and right. Like, I always have to think through it. So if you see me slow down, but I'm trying to think, do I mean east or do I mean west? It's because my brain cannot keep them straight. It's definitely a challenge being a meteorologist when I have to think about east and west every time, but that's okay. You know, it's not going to kill me. So that effect that I was talking about at the very beginning of this, with like why Barovia isn't like Seattle, we've got a little bit where maybe we're going to get that this region down here is a little bit like Seattle. So we might get heavier rains more consistently um, down here. Um, The only other thing I'll say is if we're actually looking at like high altitude mountain valley locations, they get that the in the summer the fog isn't nearly as noticeable. It's a lot more noticeable in the winter months. But we're also playing with the fact that Barovia has magically cursed mists. But that's just another reason why you should set your campaign in the winter here, because the fog is thicker, there's more to play with, it's more miserable, which I feel like is the goal in a horror campaign. Um, so if you guys have like specific questions, or if there's stuff that I didn't cover or that are just obviously missed, talk to me down in the comments. I'll try to answer stuff. I'm thinking about doing another, I'll probably break away and do a young earth creationism video again soon. But this just seems like way too much fun. But I definitely want to do like a climate analysis of like the Forgotten Realms, and I really want to do one of Exandria. I think that'd be super fun. So if you guys have like questions about climate and fantasy settings, or climate and weather for D&D, let me know, because I think this stuff is super fun. Anyway, all right, let me stop sharing. That's kind of all I've got on this video, guys. I hope you liked it, and yeah, come back next week for Wednesday shenanigans, and I'll see you guys there. Okay, bye team.